and welcome to the Giraffe Social Media Podcast. It's what social media managers are talking about. I'm Chloe Bellchamber, and on today's episode, I'm direct messaging founder and CEO of the podcast production agency Lower Street, Harry Morton. We'll be discussing if podcasting is still worth your time in 2022 and how to cut through the noise and make your agency stand out with branded podcasts. Welcome to the podcast, Harry.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. How are you today?
Very good. As I was just saying before we started recording, it's a rare blue sunny day here in England, so very much enjoying that.
Definitely, the vibes are high.
Absolutely.
Well, to kick us off, Harry, why don't you tell us about how you and your team are helping launch new podcasts over at Lower Street?
Yeah, so we're really focused on helping companies to build and find high value sort of relationships with high value clients through podcasting. So really focusing on how do we get business value out of podcasting. And we've been doing that for 5 years now, and the pandemic has definitely been thrown a bit of gas on the fire there, as I'm sure you guys have seen with social as well. It's been really a wild ride over the last 2 years, and definitely there's just a huge amount of interest in podcasting at the moment, which is wonderfully fortunate for us. But it also means it's a really kind of dynamic, ever-changing, exciting kind of space. There's a lot going on at the moment. So yeah, we're enjoying it. Absolutely.
I mean, I was going to say, it seems like over the course of the pandemic, pretty much every man and his dog have gotten started with a podcast. I think there's somewhere over 4 million around today alone. So pretty crazy. But I want to know, what are the kinds of opportunities that a podcast can offer? Why is there such hype around this medium at the moment?
Yeah, well, I think potentially one of the reasons there's a lot of hype is that the barrier to entry is quite low, right? Like there's not a huge amount stopping anyone from, you don't have to buy a fancy microphone like mine. You can just kind of jump on with your MacBook and start interviewing people. So I think the barrier to entry is really low. It's a lot of fun, right? I think sometimes it can be kind of intimidating to get into video. There's I don't understand all of these different moving parts and lighting, and so podcasting can feel like sort of an easier on-ramp. But also, there's just the audience is growing, right? So we've seen through the pandemic the sort of the audience for podcasts is growing every day, and that just means that there's an awful lot of new shows being launched. As you said, every man and his dog, every grandma and their aunt are launching shows. And basically what that is, this kind of, it builds its own steam, right? Because with those new shows brings new listeners, and with those new listeners comes new creators that want to get into the space as well. So yeah, it's really dynamic. What that means though is I think that there's a real kind of need to, I think if you started a podcast in 2018, you could probably just create a show in a niche that maybe was underserved. I think what we're in a position now is knowing that all niches are, or there are new niches appearing all the time, right? But most niches are very well catered for, and so actually just kind of the bar has been raised a little bit, and so the kind of conversation becomes, how do we make something that's really unique and really valuable, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. And our job at Giraffe kind of is helping people grow and build their social media presence, their online presence. So yeah. I want to know kind of from your perspective, what is the secret to attracting engaged listeners who can help you grow that online presence, whether you're an agency like us or maybe just a passionate individual who started their own show?
Totally. I think I think they complement each other really nicely. Because what I always find myself saying in conversations is that podcasting is not viral. Like, as you will have seen from running this show for 80 plus episodes, is like, it takes a long time to build an audience. And the reason for that is that podcasting is very word of mouth based. Literally there have been studies around this, and the podcasts, the way that people discover new podcasts, the most common way is literally by people saying, hey, you should check out this new show. And that's really great, but it means it doesn't grow fast. So, so using it in combination with social, I think is great, because in social you have that opportunity to maybe grow a bit faster, reach a larger audience, both through paid or your organic stuff. With podcasting though, what you get is of the people that do listen are just a much deeper level of engagement. So if we compare, a 30 to 45 minute podcast, it's really not uncommon to see 75 to 85, even 90 plus, over 100% completion rates of those episodes as the average. And when we compare that to sort of video on social or anything else, and I'm sure you've got much better data to back that up than me, it becomes a bit more of a numbers game, right? The sort of percentage of people that actually consume all of that content is lower. And so I think that both of those have their pluses and minuses, right? And I think a combination of those two can be super powerful.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, this is probably a general opinion, but definitely from our experience here at Giraffe, one of the hardest things about starting your own podcast is cracking into that new audience of listeners, right? So is there a best way or any tips that you could give new podcasters to get from 100 listeners per episode to 1,000?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bunch. This is... I'll nerd out a bit about this for ages, so you're going to have to stop me when I get boring. But no. So there are a few different things. I think the first and most important thing, and it is so easy to say and so easy to shrug off, is focus on the content first. And it's such a boring thing because it's like everyone's like, yeah, I've got the show, the content's sorted, it's fine. Now give me the growth hacks. But truly, we talked about at the beginning how there's ever increasing competition for the earballs of the podcasting space. So we have to really make something that is uniquely valuable. And where that starts is truly understanding our listener. I think so often one of the biggest mistakes we see people make is they come into podcasting with, I've got this great idea. I want to interview thought leaders or experts in this particular niche and put out some content. It's going to be great. And that's wonderful. The problem with that is you're thinking about the content first, and then you're going to go out into the world and trying to find the listeners. And what we always try to encourage is, well, let's focus instead on who do we really want as our audience? Like, what is the audience that we're trying to serve? And then truly understand what they care about and what they already listen to and what they already kind of consume on social and that sort of stuff. And then try to figure out what is the show that's missing in their life that we can create for them. And that may not change the sort of topics that we're going to talk about, but the way that we package that and deliver that and frame that is going to be different. So I would really encourage anyone trying to grow an audience in podcasting to really, really just have a laser focus on their listener first. But anyway, no one listened to this podcast for that answer, so we'll park that and move on. Take that as a given. I think what we've seen, and I don't know if you guys have tried this with your show, is we and many other people, friends in the industry, have found that social media, while it is a wonderful place to repurpose our podcast content and use that to kind of engage audiences there, it's actually really hard to make that jump from social to podcasts. So for example, if you're scrolling through your Instagram feed, you're looking for like bite-sized stuff. You just want to like hit the double tap like button, share it with a friend maybe, and just kind of enjoy something for a very short period of time. And I don't know what the average kind of time spent on Instagram is, but I imagine you're in and out kind of a lot faster. So asking someone to go from that mode into, okay, now go listen to 40 minutes worth of kind of really detailed, in-depth content is a really hard user journey to make. And so paid social, organic social is wonderful, but very hard to work for podcasting. So the channels that we focus on instead, and encourage everybody to think about what they could do in this way, is reaching podcast listeners where they already are, which is, of course, listening to podcasts. So the channels that we really focus on are, how can you get in front of those audiences? By sponsoring other podcasts, by partnering with other podcasts is a really good one, especially for folks starting out that don't necessarily have a huge budget to put behind this. They can do cross promotions, and so we'll shout out your podcast on our feed, and you can do the same, or episode drops, kind of like a channel takeover on YouTube or something, to really allow your cross pollinate those audiences basically. And I think sometimes there's a little bit of pushback of, are we sending our audience away? And the truth is, it's really not a zero sum game, right? So, I think the average listener of a podcast consumes 7 podcasts a week. So, by recommending another show, you're not losing out on a listener. You're just adding to their kind of thing. So collaborating with other podcasters, sponsoring other shows to get in front of them, being a guest on other podcasts is another really good way to get in front of those audiences. So yeah, just really focusing on where are people that are already listening to podcasts, where are they hanging out, with relevant content to yours.
I love that. Catch us implementing these tips, over the next few months after this.
Awesome. Yeah, great.
Harry, you touched on in one of my previous questions kind of that listenership and how long people are listening to podcasts in comparison to maybe video content elsewhere. Does listenership affect how many people a podcast is shown to on platforms like Spotify or Apple Podcasts? Like, is it a valuable insights in terms of, whatever algorithm those platforms are using?
Yeah, so as is sort of probably no surprise, these algorithms are a bit of a black box. We can't really understand what goes on behind them. I think it's safe to say that, yes, engagement data, particularly on Spotify, I think Apple's kind of ranking system is potentially a little more antiquated. It's been around for a while and could maybe do with some love. But Spotify, care deeply about the engagement rates on their platform as much as YouTube would, for example. So definitely that engagement rate is really important. But I think actually the sort of one of the things that controls a show's growth within the charts is really quite simply, and we're talking about Apple Podcasts here, and just a reminder that Apple Podcasts is 60% of the podcast market. It's still very much the platform to optimize for if we're thinking about podcasts. Their algorithm is heavily based around the number of new subscribers you've received within a 24 or 48 hour window with some sort of weighted average. I'm not a mathematician. I've got no idea how it works. But the point is they care about how many new people have signed up to listen to this podcast on a regular basis today or yesterday. And that's what shoots you up. So, if you can get hundreds or thousands of new subscribers within a short window, that will rocket you up the charts. And then you have this sort of self-fulfilling benefit of like you get more exposure by being higher up, and that shoots you further up and so on. And so that's how people like Joe Rogans of the world are sort of very hard to topple once they get up there. So that's what all of the sort of tactics we use from a promotional standpoint as well. We want to try and get them to land together as much as possible to really kind of give those kind of boosts of growth at one time. So another thing that works really well in that regard is contests. So that's something we're experimenting with a lot at the moment is kind of really incentivizing people. Hey, go and follow the show on Apple. And the language is follow, not subscribe now, because of course you can subscribe to paid podcasts. But follow this podcast and leave us a rating and review to enter the contest to win whatever. We see really, really great results from that at the moment as well. So I think that's something we encourage people to try out.
Absolutely. I want to steer a little bit away now and talk about, generating an income, because very few podcasters are able to turn their shows into profitable marketing channels for their business. So I want to know, again, what are some of your top tips as someone who has helped produce some of the top 1% of podcasts? Yeah,
so I think, speaking purely for ourselves, we produce podcasts for brands. So in our world, monetization of content is about driving business, whatever that looks like for them. It might be brand awareness, it might be directly growing leads, it could be all kinds of things. But for monetization in general, I think the sort of the easy way in, the sort of tried and true method is purely it being a numbers game. So wanting to having to hit a certain number of downloads per month. And if you can hit the sort of 10,000 downloads per episode, then you're in what is considered sort of industry standard entry level. You can monetize this content that is monetized at what is called a CPM, so a cost per thousand impressions. So if you have 10,000 listeners, that's 10 times your cost per thousand, and that is typically anywhere between sort of $18 and $25 per thousand. So you might be able to kind of, all of that math's probably not interesting to anybody, but what that means is you might be able to make $250 off an episode, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where you can start. Now, we've just talked about how hard it is to grow audiences. That's a lot of work to do to get to the point where you're making $250 per sponsor per episode. So unless you've got a 45-minute show that's just back-to-back ads, that might not necessarily kind of make sense. But we see a lot of podcasters with a lot of success earlier than that by having a very, very clear audience. So I talked earlier about understanding your audience. If you can really clearly articulate to a sponsor who your audience is and why that's valuable to them, then you can get really high value sponsors for much smaller audiences. And the benefit of doing that, of course, is then you then have the resources to invest in growing it to reach those larger numbers as well. So if you can, for example, again, I think about in terms of businesses. So if you can say, we have an audience of 500 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. Well, that's a very clear value proposition, right? You've got an engaged audience of 100 people that have a lot of buying power there, and so there's a lot of people that would pay to get in front of that. So I think, if you can very clearly articulate the niche of your audience, who they are, and why, how much they care about your show, it then becomes a case of kind of doing the legwork of going out there and trying to build relationships with people that you feel could be good sponsors. But that's not something, sadly, we do, so I don't have too much experience of actually doing that successfully.
Mm-hmm. No problem. And is it the same sort of for marketing podcasts like ours? Is there a best way to kind of achieve that return on investment or even attract new clients to come and, sign with our agency, for example?
Yeah, so this is the topic I'm really passionate about. This is what we're kind of focused on at Lower Street. So we really kind of developed this to scratch our own itch, right? So I started my own agency 5 years ago as a podcasting agency. And the first few months, year or two, a lot of that business was developed through cold outreach, just emailing people, hey, we do podcasting, come and work with us. Mm-hmm. And that's great. And that started to build some momentum. But what we found was there was a real problem with finding the right kinds of leads, like clients that you could really do the best work for and were the best for you to work with. But I saw around me like lots of agencies and other companies using podcasting really successfully themselves. And so for us and for our clients, I just sort of made it my mission to crack, how do we use podcasting to generate ROI with the understanding that it can take time to build an audience? How do we make sure that it delivers value today? And so what we've kind of arrived at is this idea that we want to focus, especially in the early days, on the guests of your podcast being the value to you as the business owner. So if we can interview and build relationships with high value prospects, then we almost don't mind if nobody listens. You would just send it to our gran and she can listen to it, and that's she'll send us wonderfully supportive messages. But what we've had is conversations with really high value people, and from a salesperson, a business development person's point of view, inviting somebody onto your podcast is a much, much easier ask than, hey, can I send you my pitch deck, right? So it's a really wonderful tool like that. So that's it for companies thinking about podcasting. That's what we really, really encourage them to think about is how can you have weekly conversations with ideal fits for your business, meanwhile generating really high value content that you can then repurpose for your social, all that kind of stuff, and build that audience over time. And so we've through the process of trying to figure that out, we've released thousands of episodes and we've launched over 50 podcasts, and really feel like we've kind of nailed that. Some of our recent shows have hit the tops of the charts for audience growth, which is awesome. But also, more importantly, some of the CEOs that we work with have kind of generated enough business that pays for us for years in advance. So that's been really good. So yeah, in terms of businesses getting value from podcasting, focus on the guest first, and they'll help to sort of deliver that value, and then the audience piece will follow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I guess a lot of sort of agencies and industry leaders are using, typically blogs or maybe YouTube to, put information out there in the world. So how does a podcast compare to these similar marketing channels? I feel like they're quite saturated already by competing agencies. So is there a best place to start? Do podcasts kind of stand out from the crowd in that way?
Yeah, so I think similar to what we were talking about with social, I think they are really complementary. So if we think about like SEO, for example, podcasting is wonderful for SEO because you've got all these guests. You guys have got 80 episodes. That might be as many as 80 guests that are all going to link back to you. So that's a really great thing. Those conversations can be repurposed into written content. So in terms of the value proposition of one versus the other, I think, SEO is always going to be super important, right? So written content's always going to be relevant and super important. I think podcasting is just a different channel and something that adds something new that it isn't elsewhere. As I mentioned before, if we're reaching out to prospects, most of the people within our industry, and I'm speaking for myself, and I think it's true for all of the clients we work with, the people they're reaching out to be on their podcast haven't been invited to be on a podcast before. So they're really excited to have that invitation. So that's a wonderful ego stroke. And so you're unlikely to get that same response to, hey, we're doing a listicle and we're sort of, we're interviewing 50 of the top CMOs for their opinion on what 2022 is going to look like for social. That's going to be harder to get a response because everyone's been asked to do that 100 times. Mm-hmm. But being on a podcast, not so much. So I think it's a really wonderful kind of door opener, podcasting. And the final thing I'll say on it as well, I think on a slightly different note, is that I think the benefit of podcasting is that we can reach people where we otherwise wouldn't be able to. So, for example, when someone's driving or walking the dog or cooking, they can't be watching your video content or reading your article, but they can be listening to your podcast. So I think that's just a really lovely addition to that. Is it's just sort of this other time in the day when you can kind of reach your market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned SEO kind of early on there. Does that have a particular influence on your podcast reach? Like, should we be setting up dedicated websites just for our podcast? Or is it as simple as you mentioned, turning an episode into written content?
Yeah, so I think the latter in terms of kind of, the sort of desktop related traffic. But I think one of the things that we think about a lot is podcast specific SEO. So that being, how does your show get surfaced on Apple and on Spotify? And so thinking about titles are so important, and show descriptions and transcripts to allow things to get surfaced for the keywords that you care about. So I think that's a really important element to consider. I think enough people don't think about their titles actually. So it's a really kind of big area. In terms of a podcast living in its own space, I think, to be honest, it's often best to just leverage the kind of domain authority, if we're getting real technical about it, that you have on your main website. And kind of just allowing it to live there, and any kind of additional link juice that you build by people linking to it is going to benefit the bigger picture. But I tend to think about SEO with podcasting in terms of platform specific. One other thing to say is that Google are now, you probably know this, but Google are sort of surfacing audio as kind of part of their results on searches. So your podcast episode, again, if the title is optimized and the transcript is there, and Google can tell that this clearly answers the question that's being asked, then your show could be sort of featured there in the same way that a video thumbnail might be. So I think that's another big plus. Yeah, amazing.
That's really cool to know. Creating an episode structure that flows and attracts the right listeners is much harder than it sounds. Take it from us. And you kind of touched on at the top of the episode, putting your listeners first, really identifying who your listenership is before you kind of go and create that content. But what are the best ways to prepare for a successful episode that will hopefully hit the top of the charts?
Yeah, totally. And because I think basically it's preparation, right? And so you sort of hinted at it, and preparation is so important, because I think so often we just get excited. Hey, we're going to speak to this subject matter expert. We're going to sit down, ask them a few questions, and they'll just be clever and entertaining. Unfortunately, you might get stuck with a dud like me who just bubbles on and bumbles in a sort of uninteresting and very unclear way. And so you're at the whim of their ability to sort of clearly communicate what you want for your audience. So I think preparation is just so important. The way that we think about it is we want to really, firstly, just clearly research the guests that we're speaking to understand what expertise do they have and what are they going to bring, and more importantly, what are they bringing to our audience that they care about. Once we understand that, we can then pick out the elements of their story, their background, their knowledge that forms some sort of a narrative. And so we'd like to think of things in sort of a 3-act piece. So your sort of setup, your conflict, your resolution. How can we turn what is a business conversation? This is about growth tactics in podcasting. How can we turn that into some sort of narrative arc? Because story is what keeps people hooked, right? If you're listening to someone, no matter how boring the story, you want to know what happens when they get to the end of the corridor, or when whatever that thing might be. And so narrative is super important. So the sort of the basics of it are doing your research and planning really clearly in advance what's the sort of trajectory that I want this interview to follow. And then if you've got more time and resources beyond that, then the next level up is then doing a bit of storytelling. So using some narrative and actually after you've edited a podcast together, you can then use narration to kind of link certain segments together and really tell that story that you want to tell. that's one of the things that we're really focused on, that again elevates like an average show from a really good one, when we're trying to stand out from this sea of content. So yeah, it's all about sort of trying to really curate this experience for the listener that they're not able to find on other podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's kind of something you've touched on there that maybe not a lot of people consider, and I know that our editor is definitely writing notes right now. So
awesome. Well, I hope you get into it. It's definitely a lot more work, but if you're committed to podcasting, it definitely pays dividends. Yeah,
absolutely. I want to kind of go back to the social side again, because we are, of course, a social media agency. You're a podcasting agency, so it's nice that we can kind of, put our brains together for the listeners.
For sure.
But what are some good ways to incorporate or to promote your podcast through your social media and content strategy? Because I know you mentioned it's kind of hard to convince people to, escape Instagram or Facebook and move over to Spotify and, follow the links. The user journey can be quite long, right? So
exactly,
is it worth kind of, convincing people to stop what they're doing and listen, or, continue to create that bite-sized content that they can consume on the go?
Definitely. Yeah. So I think, if we look at a case study, I don't know what everybody thinks about Joe Rogan. I'm not his number one fan, but sure, he's succeeded, right? And I think a big part of his success has been this strategy he's used of breaking up his large episodes into these kind of bite-sized chunks. Because I think I mentioned a while ago that podcasting is a word-of-mouth medium. So people discover it because their friends tell them to go and listen to it. I think a lot of trouble that many podcasters have is that their podcast isn't recommendable. As in, it's very hard to say, hey, go and check out this podcast. Whereas Joe Rogan makes that incredibly easy, because he's got these like 8-minute chunks. Elon Musk smoking a joint, Elon Musk talking about why AI is going to destroy us all. And those are really clickbaity things, but they're very easy to share on social. They're very easy to share with a friend. And so you can then, as a person that's never heard of who Joe Rogan is before, can spend 5 minutes or 8 minutes, I guess, getting a taster for what this show is and what it's all about. So I think having those kind of bite-sized chunks is super important. And I think having a YouTube strategy with your podcast is super important as well, because, for example, we're recording here on Riverside, which is awesome, by the way. So many podcasters don't use a decent platform, so I'm very happy to be here. We're recording video right now, so it's kind of a no-brainer to use that on all the different channels. And so, for example, what we'll do is we'll have the audio version, which will be a very tightly edited with narration, as I talked about before. So that's the really kind of highly curated version of the podcast. But then we'll say on the podcast, hey, if you like this, there's an unabridged, uncut edit on YouTube. So that means, so for example, if you've got a 45-minute episode and you edit that down to 25 minutes, there's just stuff that's left on the cutting room floor. You can say, hey, well, if you're really engaged with us, go to YouTube. You can watch the Talking Heads version. There's even more goodness of Elon Musk getting high, and then you can make those sort of smaller chunk pieces. So on specific subjects, 8-minute chunks, and similarly for social, we want to make sort of socially native content. So that might be 30 seconds to a minute, much shorter, but really kind of diving into a very actionable or insightful or engaging or exciting or scary or whatever moment that will kind of grab a bit of attention and allow people to just sort of taste the brand, basically. So I hope I've answered the question there, but yeah, I think we essentially want to be everywhere. When we're creating a podcast, we're making this amazing piece of content that can just be repurposed into all these different buckets.
Definitely. And it sounds like video is a really great way to go. I mean, we use Riverside, as you just said, but what about people who aren't kind of either interviewing someone where they need to use like a camera connection? Maybe they're doing it solo, they just started. Is whipping out the phone and recording what you're saying for a few minutes decent enough for social media use?
Yeah, so I mean, actually, we always advise, or often advise, that social native content is going to be better, as you guys, I'm sure, will sing from the rooftops. So, like, if you're a podcaster, you could just take a soundbite, and you should take sound bites of your podcast and put them onto social. But actually, what we see performs much better is if you just do like a selfie video in portrait mode of just like, hey, I just recorded this amazing episode. It's about, if it's a guest, it's with so and so, and they're amazing for this reason. Or I just recorded this episode. It's all about the 5 reasons why social's going to kill it in 2022. that is like, it's a piece of content made for social, and that's much more likely to get the engagement you're looking for, and then you can start pointing them towards your podcast. So yeah, but if you're getting into podcasting, you're probably already doing that sort of content on social. But if we're talking about purely just kind of growing awareness of a podcast, that's how we like to recommend the use of social. I don't know how you feel about that, because I'm sure you have a lot of things to say about kind of native content versus repurposed.
No, totally. I think the way that we kind of promote it on our channels is through video and through little clips where we can, and we all know video content is really killing it at the moment, so it's the best way to kind of grab that attention and shout about it. So yeah, I completely agree.
For sure. Awesome.
One of my last questions for you that I always kind of like to ask the people who are, in these specific industries is, what have been some of your favorite podcasts that you've helped produce to date? You mentioned you've helped produce over 50 podcasts. Some of them have been in the top 1%. So I'm interested to know. Thanks for asking. That's nice to be able to brag. I'll try not to blush. So we produce a podcast called Secret Leaders, which is kind of a British entrepreneurship show. They've interviewed some really amazing people, and that's reached the top of the business charts a number of times. They've been really cool to work with for many years now. And then we work with a lot of brands. So we're working with HPE. We've won some awards with the shows that we're producing there, all about technology and enterprise tech. We're working with Stanford Graduate School of Business on a podcast called Grit and Growth, which we're really passionate about. It's about entrepreneurship in Africa and South Asia. So that's been a really, really interesting project to work on. And these are all sort of, these kind of narrated, almost documentary style shows. They're the ones that we're really excited about. But also we absolutely love working on podcasts for small businesses as well, where they are using this strategy, as I talked about before. It's what I'm really passionate about is helping businesses grow by using podcasts. And they aren't necessarily the big famous shows that you'll hear reeled off, but they are, as I say, interviewing these people in their industry that is providing a lot of value to them and generating a lot of business. So we're really excited about those shows too. Amazing. Yeah, it sounds like you got a lot of awesome projects in the works, and hopefully more great ones to come in the future as well.
I hope so.
Well, Harry, my final question for you is, what are your predictions for the future of podcasting and podcasting trends?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot happening. So we've seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions in the podcasting space. We've seen Spotify scoop up loads of different production companies and ad companies. There's just a lot of consolidation going on at the moment, if we talk sort of high-level business stuff. And the reason that's interesting is that it's really helping to mature the industry. It was kind of podcasting still is a bit of a wild west, where it's just kind of anyone can start a podcast. There's nothing stopping you, and there's no central place that's organizing it. There's lots of these different big companies like Apple and Spotify and Amazon now and Google all vying for dominance in this space. And so what that means is lots of companies getting scooped up, and the rule book isn't written. And so there's just a lot of kind of ducking and weaving and figuring stuff out, and a lot of things that work for one podcast might not work for another. So I think what that means is it's actually really dynamic and exciting. There's just a lot happening. I think also what that's doing is bringing a lot of new listeners in, a lot of new awareness to the space, a lot of investment to the space. And the new listeners, we're broadening our demographic. I think podcasting used to be really white middle-aged man dominant, right? And it's now suddenly, excitingly, not that anymore. There's a lot younger people, there's a lot of older people, and so that audience is starting to sort of flesh out a bit more, and that's opening up the opportunity for different types of content. We're seeing really exciting opportunities for short form and daily content, particularly on younger skewing shows and platforms like Spotify. If you've got a sub 10-minute episode, Spotify loves that stuff because they can slot it in their playlist between music tracks, and it kind of works really well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and there's in-car audio and smart speakers and stuff, these kind of new frontiers of where audio is going to live, and we're going to interact with it more regularly. I think it's going to just really change the kind of use case for audio. So I think it's just constantly evolving, and really, like I said, the rule book isn't written. There's no one thing that will work. So I think there's a lot of room for innovation, to use a boring businessy speak word, but a lot of just kind of imagination, creativity, to do with it as you see fit. And I think if you're always got that laser focus I mentioned of the listener and what they care about and what they want, then there's a lot of fun to be had and cool ideas to be generated.
Definitely. Well, before we wrap things up, we do have short time for our rapid recommendations segment where we find out what our guests have been loving and what they can't live without. So, Harry, I have 3 questions for you.
Wonderful.
The first is, what's one app or tool that you simply couldn't live without?
One app or tool? Well, as a podcaster, I rely heavily on voice memos, and that might seem very low tech, but the voice memos app is amazing. I mean, apart from the fact that about 50% of it is the sound of my toddler making ridiculous noises, the other half is podcast interviews and leaving notes and recording segments for podcasts. You'd be surprised at how good the microphone on your phone is, and actually, there's very usable stuff there. So I'm very much advocating for the voice memos app.
Okay, I know voice memos as, the microphone is quite good because, when you were a kid, you'd always thought you had what it takes to be a pop star, and you would record yourself singing and listen back and just immediately regret. So I'm glad to know that it serves a purpose kind of past that point.
Absolutely. I mean, don't get me wrong. I do, I love strapping on the leg warmers and standing in front of the mirror and recording the songs too. Well, but that's,
I'm glad
I tend not to share that so much.
My next question is, who is one brand or persona that you think is getting social media or podcasting right at the moment?
Who's a brand or presence? I think someone that's just been, we talked about audience growth and podcast audience growth. Someone that's doing just an amazing job of that is Jordan Harbinger. He's got one of the biggest shows out there, and he's completely independent and has grown it himself. Super smart guy. Whether or not you're super excited by his content, I think he's got a really cool story and has done some cool stuff. So definitely check him out.
Awesome, will do. And finally, what's one valuable resource, event, or group that you think our listeners should know about?
Well, there is now your editor's going to have to get involved here because I'm going to Google it. The Podcast Show London is going to be in, where is it? It's in London, obviously, because it's in the title. 25th to the 26th of May. I think that is, if anyone's excited by podcasting, they should head to the Podcast Show in London on the 25th and 26th of May, because I think if you're interested in learning more about podcasting, that's one of the best places to be. It's going to be the meeting point of lots of people in the industry, and I'll certainly be there nerding out with all the other audio nerds, so you can come and say hello. Amazing.
Yes, we might make a little giraffe day trip up there.
Definitely.
Well, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Harry. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, or follow us if you're listening on Spotify. We would love to hear what you thought about today's interview, so make sure you reach out on social media and let us know what you thought. We've been Giraffe Social Media. You've been amazing. We'll see you next time.